purposes of these remarks, I will assume that Alice Drager and J. Michael Bailey, along with the likes of David Horowitz, Lynn Cheney, and many others over the past several years, are quite sincere in their vociferous defense of what they call academic freedom. I make this assumption not because I believe it to be the only reasonable interpretation of the relevant facts, but because their sincerity, or lack thereof, is ultimately irrelevant to the question at hand. Specifically, what is the nature of the academic freedom that Bailey, Drager, et al. Are so forcefully defending? Because of the narrow question presented, there will be no detailed discussion of such interesting subjects as the scientific status of J. Michael Bailey's The Man Who Would Be Queen, or the underlying work by Blanchard et al. On which that book was almost exclusively based. These matters have been discussed exhaustively elsewhere by myself and others. In examining the nature of the freedom so vigorously defended by Bailey et al., I will not make assumptions based on common usage or dictionary definitions. Instead, I will ascertain the contours of the academic freedom, a la Bailey, Drager, et al., based on the specific conduct they claim violates it. Only by taking them at their word and looking in the directions in which they point us, can we truly begin to comprehend their understanding of the concept and situate this understanding within its proper historical and political context. In determining the contours of academic freedom defended by Bailey, Drager, et al., it is initially instructive to ask what conduct, in their view, falls within its scope, either as an exercise or a permissible defense of academic freedom. As strident defenders of academic freedom, it's reasonable to assume that they would not engage in any conduct that they themselves considered violent by it. It should be noted here, we're concerned with the minimum scope of Bailey-Drager academic freedom. Given the limited data available, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to locate the outer limits of Bailey-Drager academic freedom. However, based on the conduct of Bailey and Drager themselves, and the conduct assailed by them as violative of academic freedom, we can determine what, at a bare minimum, it includes, and how, at a minimum, it can be violated. It is useful at this point to start by asking, who are the beneficiaries and the addressees of the right? That is, who can assert the right and against whom? The second prong of the question is the simpler of the two. Bailey-Drager academic freedom may be asserted against anyone. There is no limitation, as is customary in legal definitions of academic freedom, to state and quasi-state actors. Here, for example, Bailey and Drager have asserted that their academic freedom has been violated by fellow academics, a graduate student, and persons entirely outside of the academic establishment with no nexus with the state. At first glance, it may seem obvious who can claim the protection of Bailey-Drager academic freedom. Based on the cases in which Bailey and Drager have asserted that his or their academic freedom has been violated, it might appear that Bailey-Drager academic freedom is a purely status-based right. A person holding an academic position may assert the right with regard to conduct of any kind, even when, as in the case of The Man Who Would Be Queen, the asserting party expressly disavows any intention of engaging in scholarly activities, at least subsequently. However, this picture omits an important aspect. Bailey and Drager assert that their academic freedom has been violated by conduct, including conduct by persons holding academic positions, that is virtually indistinguishable from the conduct they assert is protected by academic freedom when engaged in by them. Indeed, the only meaningful difference between the conduct that Bailey and Drager consider to be protected by their version of academic freedom and the conduct they consider to be a violation of their version of academic freedom is that the protected conduct is their own, whereas the virtually indistinguishable violative conduct is that of their critics. Thus, as we will see, Bailey-Drager academic freedom accords heightened protection to their right as academics to engage in whatever conduct they wish, while prohibiting any criticism of that conduct by anyone. There is no requirement that their conduct be scholarly in nature, nor that those against whom the right is asserted be state actors. In analyzing this, it's useful to consider a couple of case studies. I've picked a few that I consider instructive. For the most part, criticism of The Man Who Would Be Queen, unlike the book itself, has been a fairly decorous affair, conducted at the level of fact, research, science, and ethics. Thus, there's been only one case in which the criticism can be considered to have even approached the edge of the minimum scope of the conduct protected by Bailey-Drager academic freedom. The captions placed by Andrea James on publicly available photographs of Bailey's children. However, before we conclude that this conduct is analogous to Bailey, certain distinguishing factors must be taken into account. Of these, the most important distinction is the intent. Unlike Bailey's portrayal of transsexual women as inherently deceptive beings who transition either to enhance their masturbatory activities or to bed as many heterosexual men as possible, the latter group being, quote, especially suited to prostitution, end quote, and quote again, especially motivated, end quote, to commit theft. Andrea James was by no means seeking to convince her audience of the truth of her captions. To my knowledge, not even Bailey and Drager claimed that James' captions were intended as factual assertions, nor has James at any time asserted that there was a scientific or other factual basis for the content of those captions. Rather, James' purpose was to point out to those who saw the captions how they would feel if the labels Bailey has called sympathetic when aimed at trans women were instead directed at their own children. Furthermore, in response to the entirely predictable outrage, James, who, whatever one may think of the method, had proved her point, issued an apology and removed the offending pictures from her website. This indisputably and intentionally offensive act, of which much has been made by Bailey and company, stands in stark contrast to Bailey's own conduct that clearly falls within the heightened protection of Bailey-Drager academic freedom. It's uncontroversial that the epithets Bailey directed at trans women as a group were meant to be taken as fact. Indeed, they are printed in a book that proclaims itself the science on the subject, a book that's based on, quote, Bailey's original research. While Bailey has not always been entirely consistent on whether the book is to be treated as a scientific work, depending on whether he wishes to claim the authority of science or duck the responsibility that comes with it, he has never suggested that it was intended as a satire or parody of certain fields of science. Indeed, the one matter in which he has not wavered is the fundamental scientific accuracy of his proclamation that all trans women are liars seeking to live out sexual fantasies. Any clinician or researcher who begs to differ is squeamish or not scholarly enough, and accordingly does not even deserve to be mentioned by name.